and I would like to open this event by acknowledging the land where the University of Toronto operates, and also to invite anyone who's not in Toronto to reflect within your own space. So the land that Toronto sits upon carries the interconnected stories and histories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga Anishinaabeg nations. Toronto today is the treaty land and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and is on land governed by the Dish with One Spoon agreement to share the land reciprocally between the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee nations. Toronto is also home today to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, as well as millions of other settlers and arrivants who have come recently or not so recently, willingly or unwillingly to this land. I think that acknowledging the land in this way, of course, just represents a very small start towards the work of decolonization. It does encourage reflection on how we are personally connected to the land, what our responsibilities are as a result. So for instance, I personally situate myself on this land as a settler of European ancestry. And as such, I have come to realize the many ways that I've benefited from this violent colonial project on this land. This project has worked for multiple centuries to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their homelands, cultures, and knowledges, to instead impose settler European lifestyles and values, and this violence is ongoing today. Settler colonial ideologies not only continue to impact Indigenous peoples and communities both locally and globally, but also the land itself through environmental destruction. Despite this, the land continues to nurture and care for us. The sun shines through our windows. It provides us with energy each day, and Indigenous peoples continue to stand at the front lines in protecting the land, recognizing we are all interdependent and deconstructing colonial narratives that try to separate us and say that we're not. So I therefore recognize my responsibility and commitment as a settler to likewise resist these harmful narratives and to work towards goals such as Indigenous sovereignty and land back through a fostering of reciprocal and caring relationships with one another and also with the land. So within the same spirit of relationship building, I am very, very pleased to present our speaker for today, Diana Barrero. Diana is a Latina feminist researcher, educator, and community organizer who today will be discussing her doctoral work, Con Hilo y Aguja, Colombian Women's Use of Needlework and the Remaking of Zones of Extraction. Diana, thank you so much for being here today to share and discuss your work, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to see such a big turnout for today's event. I'm going to be sharing my screen, so hopefully this works. I think everyone should be able to see my screen at the moment. Could you just let me know with a thumbs up? Yes, is that a yes? Perfect. So my name is Diana Barrero. I'm a PhD candidate in curriculum teaching and learning. I'm also doing a collaborative specialization in the Women and Gender Studies program. And as it was mentioned, I'm going to be presenting a section of my doctoral research, Con Hilo y Aguja, Colombian Women's Use of Needlework and the Remaking of Zones of Extraction. So as part of my doctoral research, I examined the different ways that Colombian women have taken up the practice of textiles to make visible their struggles for truth and justice in the context of the Colombian armed conflict. And as part of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the Tejedoras de Mapujan, the Mapujan weavers, a collective of Afro-Colombian women who have created over 200 textiles portraying the colonial violence and dispossession that occurred at the intersection of Colombia's extractive zones. So for a bit of context, in the early 2000s, the Colombian state began a process of peace and reconciliation by negotiating with various illegal armed conflict groups that were part of the internal armed conflict that has spanned over 6 decades. The result of these negotiations, as well as the advocacy of victims and human rights organizations, has been the creation of a legal and discursive framework of transitional justice. This framework tasks the state with the responsibility of constructing a comprehensive narrative of the armed conflict as a form of symbolic reparation towards the victims. And so here I have a clip from a newspaper that says that the power of victims in the implementation of the 2016 peace accord between the Colombian state and the FARC, a leftist guerrilla group in Colombia. However, integrating the perspective of victims and other historically marginalized communities as part of historical narratives, of official historical narratives, presents many challenges. And so, given that the official historical narratives, which are produced by state-led institutions, so that includes truth commissions, museums, and schools, exist alongside other unofficial narratives that are produced by victim-led and community-based initiatives, there are struggles over the interpretation and representation and resignification of the past identities and events. And this is what we call the politics of memory. And in the case of Colombia, where the state itself has been a perpetrator of violence, one of the challenges of constructing a comprehensive narratives includes the appropriation of victims' narratives by the state to legitimize its own authority. So here in another newspaper clip, it actually talks about how one of the mechanisms for transitional justice, a special jurisdiction for peace, which is a judicial mechanism, actually call upon and has laid charges against the director of the central, the former director of the National Center for Historical Memory, because during his mandate, there were very problematic ways in which the narrative of the armed conflict was being taken up and represented. And so he's now being called upon to testify. And so for my doctoral project, I draw from feminist scholarship in memory studies, transitional justice, as well as educational research on social movements to understand how gendered and racialized dynamics operate in memorialization process in Colombia. So in my work, I focus on the production and circulation of textile narratives and their political and pedagogical implications for peace building and reconciliation. And so through my research, I seek to map the use of these political textiles by women's groups in Colombia as part of broader social justice movements. And these are some of the research questions that have guided my research so far. And so as form of knowledge and cultural production, textiles and other forms of needlework have enabled marginalized women, particularly those from lower socioeconomic and rural backgrounds, to enter the public sphere. And in the case of Colombia, many of these textiles illustrate the complexity of women's everyday experiences with structural inequality and the way that it has been exacerbated by the conflict's violence. And so the use of textiles by Colombian women, it actually follows a long tradition in Latin America. And so here, I'm going to be presenting two examples. One of them was created at the start of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. So this one is titled 11th of September, 1973, when it was the coup that led to the ousting of Allende and the beginning of Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. And these arpilleras, as they're called in Chile, have documented women's everyday social reality, including soup kitchens, protests, political violence, as well as human rights violations. However, these textiles have also been used to complement the work of more formal processes of reconstructing historical memory, such as truth commission. And so in this second example, I'm showing a textile created by the Asociación Cuyunacui in 2002, and which was presented to before the Peruvian Truth Commission. And so my project draws on digital ethnographic methods to map out the textile-based memory initiatives in Colombia. And so as part of the first phase of my study, I collected and analyzed publicly available data from digital archives, websites, online news sites, and social media platforms. And this initial stage has allowed me to understand how digital artifacts related to these initiatives produce and circulate individual as well as collective identities, representations, and imaginaries. And so for today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some initial findings from this first stage. For the second stage, I lived in Colombia for 5 months last year. After U of T lifted its travel restrictions due to the pandemic. And as part of this stage, I conducted participant observation and semi-structured interviews to deepen my understanding of how textile narratives have taken up across sites, histories, and the current debates. Just 1 second. I'm going to be step. Thank you. I forgot my charger. So as part of today's presentation, I'm actually going to be presenting one of the works from el colectivo de mujeres tejedoras de sueños y sabores de paz. They're commonly referred to as the tejedoras de Mapujan, the Mapujan weavers. And they're a collective, as I mentioned before, of Afro-Colombian women from Colombia's Caribbean coast. And their works have been displayed at the National Museum in Bogota, as well as national and international exhibitions. And in 2015, they received the National Peace Prize for their work. And so while their case has become relatively well known in Colombia, the way that their work has been represented through mainstream discourses often overemphasizes the healing of victims and from their experiences of trauma, as well as gender discourses of social forgiveness. So here I have 2 clips. Two newspaper clips. In the first one, there's sort of this discourse of healing and kind of overcoming their experiences of trauma. And then in the second clip, there's sort of this emphasis on femininity and forgiveness as sort of 2 discourses that are linked. And so there is less, however, an emphasis placed on the role that the political economy has played in the dynamics of the conflict at the local level and the way in which their works through their textiles takes up these dynamics. So the tejedoras de Mampujan originate from the town of Mampujan in the Montes de Maria region on Colombia's Caribbean coast. And this region's strategic location has served to connect large cities in the interior, so for example, Medellin and Cali, with the important seaports on the Caribbean coast. And it's actually in the second half of the 19th century that the region became the first in Colombia to implement a model of export-oriented agriculture with the production of tobacco, which had actually benefited from the reorganization of the territory during the colonial period through the imposition of the hacienda, a large state model. And so why is this relevant? Because for a significant portion of the 20th century, this region experienced land struggles stemming from extractive models of development. And in the 1970s, many of these communities had developed strong organizations, which were then weakened by state policies that promoted violent repression against them, and their logic of eliminating the communist threat. And so coming back to the more recent past, this textile was created in 2014 and is titled Ma Gente Mi Prieto. This textile synthesizes the stories told through 11 textiles produced between 2008 and 2010 following the height of the violence in 2000 that resulted in forced displacement of entire communities in this region. And this group of textiles were created as members of the town of Mampuhan were actually going through a legal dispute for land restitution within the newly implemented framework of transitional justice. This textile connects together processes of violence and dispossession arising from colonization and permeating into the present. And so before I go on to talk about the textile myself, I'm going to share a quick clip that was created from a community-based research project. I didn't create the documentary. And it's, I'm going to play a clip where the leader of As Vidas, the parent organization for this collective, Juana Alicia Ruiz, provides an overview of the textile. So hopefully I can do this smoothly. One second. Okay. And share sound. So hopefully that works too. I think you can see the video. And is the sound working?
Yeah, it's working.
Acerca de nuestra historia y logramos pues decidir que íbamos a poner un título en lengua palenquera que se va a llamar Margen de mi Prieto, que significa mi gente negra. Y ahí pues podemos mostrar un poco toda la travesía que pasaron nuestros ancestros de África hasta estos pueblos, cómo se subastaban pues nuestros ancestros, cómo pasaron hasta los montes de María, allá cómo llegaron hasta los montes de María, tenían todas sus costumbres y tradiciones formando los palenques, pero comenzaron a haber masacres, entrar armados o gente con malas intenciones, y comenzaron a haber los masacres, los desplazamientos. Después del desplazamiento viene ya un hacinamiento, ¿verdad? Y todo lo que trae, las consecuencias que trae ese hacinamiento. Allí violaciones, pleitos, contiendas. Viene un reasentamiento, que es el lugar donde estamos ahora, donde nos ubican. De ese reasentamiento nosotros comenzamos a poner como que ya las condiciones que esperábamos tener, unas buenas condiciones como acueductos, unas antenas parabólicas, la iglesia que está por sentencia cumplida, las familias ya entonces retornando como un futuro, si se retorna, ya pusimos ahí un sol, lo que está doblado, un gran sol inmenso, donde esperábamos que el camino nos conduciera hasta un retorno que sería una reparación integral transformadora.
Porque uno ahí se distrae, uno entretiene la mente.
I'll try to smoothly return to the presentation. Okay, I think you can see my presentation again. Excellent. So as the clip, hopefully you were able to hear it and see it properly. As you were able to get from what Juana was saying, the textile does not conceptualize time as linear, and instead the past, the present, and the future coexist simultaneously to illustrate the nature of structural racism, as this has impacted this particular community of Mampuhan. As you probably gathered from both the clip and what I've said so far, most of the population in this town of Mampuhan is Afro-Colombian. And so in the top left of the textile, you can see that it depicts the arrival of enslaved Africans to the shores of what is present-day Colombia. And then the following thing in the middle at the top, the textile illustrates the extractive nature. It illustrates a scene of an auction. And these are actually the two original textiles that are kind of like integrated into this textile. And so this textile illustrates the extractive nature of the colonial economy that largely depended on the dispossession of peoples from their lands and their enslavement. And then the textiles also portray more recent violence, including massacres perpetuated by paramilitary groups in 2000 as the armed conflict intensified in this region. And that led to these communities being forcibly displaced from their territories. And so paramilitary groups were using massacres as a military strategy to both control the territories and their populations. And so here on the right, you can see the original textile that depicts the forced, the displacement of the community because of the violence. And so these textiles represent women's refusals to be erased from their territory, as well as illustrate the complexity of Black geographies. And so here I'm building on the work of Catherine McKintrick in that it represents the various practices of spatialized violence that targeted Black bodies and profited from erasing Black sense of place. And then the textile depicts this from the beginning of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade to more contemporary practices of dispossession and exploitation in Colombia. And so at the center of the image, the textile depicts a maroon settlement, a palenque in Spanish, Colombian Spanish at least, where members of the community trace their foundation of their community to palenques in the area from the 19th century. And so I'm going to be sharing a map that kind of shows a few different municipalities in the region. So the town of Mapuhan, where the little red circle just appeared, is actually just over 10 kilometers from San Basilio de Palenque, a maroon settlement that acquired the status of a Black free town in 1713 after signing an agreement with the Spanish authorities. And so the residents of the Palenque still speak their own language. And as Juana showed on the video, the name of the piece comes from the lengua palenquera, and it means my Black people. And so through most of the 20th century, the Colombian state had imagined the nation as a racially mixed, culturally homogenous, based on ideologies of mestizaje. This, however, changed with the Constitution of 1991, where the state instituted ethno-racial and territorial rights for both indigenous and Black rural communities. These rights, however, for Black communities have been embodied by the figure of the rural Black farmer in the Pacific coast. And as I've mentioned before, these are communities that actually are on the Colombian Caribbean coast. And so it requires for them additional steps to be able to demonstrate their distinct cultural differences, to have their collective rights recognized. And so returning to this point, the way that the media has framed their exemplary case through gender discourses of healing and social forgiveness actually obscures the past and present structures of social and racial inequality that continues to affect their communities. And so including how past struggles, like past land struggles, has shaped the dynamics of the armed conflict at the local level, and how the conflict itself has changed those dynamics. And so, for example, state policies of economic development favored the introduction of oil palm in the region in 1998, and its expansion in the early 2000s at the height of the violence. And this expansion of the crop resulted in land accumulation and land theft, creating more and new challenges for the restitution of lands as part of transitional justice frameworks. And so furthermore, the expansion of this crop has also had a negative environmental impact due to the pollution of nearby water sources from which the community depends for their subsistence, and affected the community's food security and sovereignty. And so with this ongoing violence and lack of guarantees of non-repetition, as the image on the right shows, community leaders who have spoken about the difficulties of accessing individual and collective reparation continue to receive violent threats. And so in this presentation, I have tried to show how the textiles created by the Tejedoras de Mampuhan tell the story of a longer emancipatory and liberatory project that exceeds normative frameworks of transitional justice. They illustrate how the lives of Afro-Colombian women have been shaped by interlocking systems of oppression that include racism, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism, and that similar to the demands of other Black and indigenous movements, both in Colombia and in the Americas, the textiles envision a future where historical injustices are also addressed as part of the guarantees of non-repetition. And some of the textiles also depict a vision for the future that move away from dominant economic models based on colonial extractivism. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Diana, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I see some claps. It was fascinating to hear about your work. And I would like to open it up to anyone. If anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to, or give a comment, feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat. Realize that might take a few moments. So I don't see any hands right away. So Diana, I would be really interested in sort of hearing about your sort of coming to this project, like sort of your journey and how, like, it was really interesting to hear about your phase one, which was looking online, you said, and then going into phase two, where you actually were in the community in Colombia. And so I'm just wondering sort of how you came to that research process and what was sort of the journey.
Yeah, I think my research process, so I am now in my 6th year in the PhD. And I initially began thinking about questions of memory and memorialization of violence in my 1st year. So when I was in my 1st year of the PhD, and the way that these discourses and different practices were being taken up in Colombia. And even though a lot of these initiatives and collectives that I look through my work actually started prior to the Peace Accord from 2016. The Peace Accord itself, I think, created a platform and the possibilities for, or like that moment, that historical moment, for a lot of these narratives to come to the foreground, to people talking about this more openly in the public sphere. And so that's how I became interested in sort of questions of memory and memorialization. But this was like 2017. But then in one of my visits to Colombia, then I met one of the collectives that was based in Bogota, and kind of learned about their work that they were doing there with textiles and narratives, and through that work, I later learned that actually this is a practice that has been taken up quite widely in the country. So there's multiple collectives. So they're based in the Caribbean coast, and they're one of the first ones to take up this practice, and one of the ones that have received more recognition nationally and internationally. But there's also different collectives in different parts of the country, with more or less sort of levels of recognition. And so for me, that raised really interesting questions about, again, how those memorialization practices are happening in the country, and then how and which ones actually come to be part of sort of the broader national historical memory. And so that was some of the questions that at the beginning of my process, at the beginning of the PhD. And then in 2020, there's a pandemic, which was just about when I was going to start my field work. So I already had like my ethics ready to be submitted, or I had submitted them. And then, yeah, I had my ticket bought. I had bought my ticket. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to travel then. And so that really caused me to rethink a lot of my projects during the last couple of years. And so that's why I ended up taking up digital ethnographic methods as sort of a way to deal with those challenges of not being able to travel. But then in the end, I've had the opportunity to go to Colombia last year, and I'm going to be again this summer. And that has been a really wonderful experience to also see how it looks on the ground, sort of the work that different communities are doing, or different collectors. And then also how it gets taken up by, so that's also what my work looks at, the way that it gets taken up by other groups, other media. Hi.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks, Lois, and other folks in the room. Probably folks in the room have this experience where you know your colleagues and you sort of know broadly the work that they do, but it's not until you get to sit in a lovely presentation like this that you get to see literally in sort of textured detail the work that they're doing. So Diana, thanks so much for sharing that work today. You know, well, Diana, you know this about me. I'm a word person, so I get kind of snagged on words sometimes. And I love what you said, the argument that you ended off, that, you know, that these textiles and these sort of narratives, these material narratives, they really exceed the sort of normative frameworks, I think is the phrasing you used, of the kinds of work that is sometimes done towards transitional justice and reparations, that these are sort of texturing that in a really interesting way and maybe exceeding that in an interesting way. And the word that I kind of kept underlining in my notes as you were speaking is the word mechanism. And I guess my question, I don't know if this is probably a weird question, but my question is kind of, are these textiles a mechanism for transitional justice and reparation, or is that the wrong word in this situation? I just think about, you know, you talked about the ways that some of these textiles have been co-opted or, you know, sort of recontextualized through these more gentle narratives of, you know, everyone's better and everyone's forgiven people. And yeah, so I guess I wonder, I don't know, is it like, maybe I'm just hung up on a word, but this word mechanism, and I'm wondering, are these textiles a mechanism that's working toward those outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you make, Ty, in terms of both the language that we use, and then so on the one hand, there's like sort of official processes and mechanisms of transitional justice, and in Colombia currently, through the 2016 Peace Accord, there were 3 main ones that were created. And so that includes a judicial one that is in charge of actually like investigating and charging and finding people who are responsible of crimes. And so that's the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. There was also a Truth Commission that just finished their mandate, their 3-year mandate last year. And then there's also a humanitarian institution that is in charge of finding disappeared peoples throughout the armed conflict. And so I think when I often talk about these, I tend to use mechanisms for those more official kind of processes and institutions. But I think at the same time, when we think about, and not so much to refer to the community-based processes and collectives and their work, but at the same time, like the way that these textiles have been taken up, both through academic discourses and through other kind of political like angles, I think they have been framed as mechanisms for or artifacts for communication, right? And to tell narratives that at different stages have been served as kind of alternatives to mainstreamed discourses. So, for example, when their work actually started in the early 2000s, they had like one, it wasn't as widely known, and they weren't being celebrated, right? So they were actually struggling with a lot of getting recognized by the legal institutions to take their case seriously, to actually, because again, in the early 2000s, their community had been really stigmatized. In part, that's what also creates the conditions for the violence to occur in the first place. The stigmatization and the both from the states, but also from paramilitary groups that kind of really put them in a position of vulnerability to the violence. And so, so when they began with their process, right? They're really kind of speaking back to that forms of symbolic violence in a way. So then, I think when you think about that, right, to go to your point, like they are mechanisms to kind of speak back to those narratives. As I think the context of the country has changed, not necessarily in a linear, progressive, everything's getting better way, but as different opportunities have opened up, I think the role and function that their textiles have has also changed. I don't know if I answer your question, but.
Yeah, thanks, Diana.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, Diana, and that was such an interesting question, thinking about the mechanisms. And I was just wondering, Diana, as well, sort of building off of that, you said that you're going to go back soon. I do see another question, so maybe I'll just hold off just to allow space. Dr. Rodriguez, would you like to ask?
Yes, hi Diana. Oh my God, that was so good. I just love the color. You visually stimulated me. And I'm gonna continue on that train of stimulation. And I'm gonna tickle your heart a little bit. In terms of the theoretical approaches that you are integrating or that you're contemplating integrating into this work, are you integrating cultural theory to unpack how memory is being politicized in Colombia in terms of these notions of amnesia and convenient amnesia that is being disguised as propaganda based on what you said. So that's kind of like my question. If you're using cultural theory to approach your understanding of how the sentiment, the essence, the work of memory is being co-opted by propaganda and by institutions. And I say that because you made an observation that through the discourse of gender, the conversations are not happening in terms of giving indigenous in communities from the Palenque from the Palenque communities, they are not giving them their land back under this disguise of like you know, forgiving and like moving on and like, you know, like rapidly like pushing that. So that's why I'm just like wondering if you've walked in that arena. Yeah. Más o menos, es en español, te lo traduzco, pero de diferente manera. Si es que si quieres te lo paso en español también, porque estaba tratando de traducir así. Eso.
Gracias, Clelia. Yeah, I guess I like to think that I am using forms of cultural analysis in my work to look at, and I think in terms, that's why also for me, drawing from an ethnographic kind of approach, not necessarily to kind of, I'm going to close the thing so you can see me better. 1 second. I think I was getting lost in the glare. Yeah, so I think, so going back to the point in terms of, I'm using, yeah, so the ethnographic is not necessarily just to, and this raises a lot of different questions, right? Like how you write both about self in relationship to others. But at the same time, I think that this approach provides certain tools for understanding cultural processes and social processes and social phenomena. And so that's why I think that I am using cultural analysis when I'm looking at these work and understanding these works both as cultural artifacts and their processes as cultural production. So kind of understanding the textiles through a lens of cultural production and looking at both the material, symbolic, as well as sort of spatial dynamics that surround these works. And then in terms of the way that these unofficial community-based narratives get taken up by official institutions, yeah, that's definitely something that I'm looking into. So what I want to do next with this particular case is looking at the way it has been taken up through a curriculum document, right? And what are the different aspects of it of their work and their story that get taken up in a sort of an official lesson plan for students. But then also the other dimension that I will be looking at is how some of these initiatives collaborate with the Truth Commission, right? Because one of the approaches of the Colombian Truth Commission was to work with community-based, like arts-based groups to both be able to connect with different communities and then disseminate their work, not just through sort of an official report that was published last year, but through different media. And so that's something that I'm also looking at.
Gracias.
Thank you, Diana, so much for sharing, and thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for the question. Would anyone else? Oh, I did notice a comment from Nancy. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so hi, Diana. So nice meeting you. So I'm actually here in Colombia, and I had the opportunity to accompany the Truth Commission in some of the work that was done in different communities here in Boyacá. So I'm curious about where you're from. How do you position yourself, and what's your connection to violence, if at some point because part of the work that we do is also informed by our own experiences. So I wonder to extend your own personal experiences or your cultural background influenced decisions of engaging in this kind of work. And then I consider that your work is important because we are in a moment in Colombia where the Truth Commission has released the report that is a transmedia, as you were mentioning, where we have access to tons of, online materials. We've got a lot of testimonials, and we're doing some kind of ritual readings also here at the universities. I work at a public university and work with different communities. So part of our work is engaging in pedagogies for peace, where textile use and arts-based use practices are really considered like a tool in which we will continue to contribute into raise awareness about what it entails to build a peace and sustain peace in our country. So you know that we are starting another peace attempt of peace agreements with the ELN, which is another of the illegal armed groups here in Colombia, and there's a lot of tension in the process because we have not like fully fulfilled with all the agreements with the previous armed group, and then we are engaging in a new process. So we are in the midst of conflict, trying to build and sustain peace. That is one of our challenges as a country. And that's where different allies of the Truth Commission that are still very active are engaging in multiple different activities. And I consider that your work is contributing to build those narratives in terms of what it entails to heal. And that's one of the things that I want to highlight on your work, because that's how communities have been seeing arts-based research or arts-based practices like Mapuhan, the women of Mapuhan. It's as a healing practice, and something that you leave me thinking about is precisely how we can approach communities and probably tune their voices more. Instead of us, as you were using the word co-opt in academia, like their experiences and trying to translate the meaning of communities, right? It's like, what does it really mean for communities? And then healing, there's a lot of healing behind, and it is a ritual, even creating this kind of pieces where people can really start acknowledging each other, reconciling with the communities, reconciling with the territory, and also start like building intergenerational dialogues as well. So there's like multiple layers of insights that we discover when we work and talk to these communities. So thank you so much for your work. And then, I'm curious about, your positionality and how it informs the kind of work that you're doing. And thank you for the work that you do, because I will make it also visible here at the university, and I will invite you also to talk to our community here, because that would be super cool to get to know how the work is being seen and how the Truth Commission has impacted different territories and in different ways, and making this part of the activities visible is one of the ways. So nice meeting you, and thank you, Luis, and everyone at the OEC Center for creating these wonderful spaces.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for your comment and your comments about my work. It's really nice to hear. It's actually, I think, the first time that I'm presenting to a larger audience here at OEC and abroad. So first of all, I'm Colombian. I'm from Hilo y Aguja. I came to Canada when I was 12, 13 in the early 2000s. And I think for me, one of the things that kind of hooked me into this discourses or processes of memory and memorialization as somebody who grew up in the diaspora has been learning about the history of the country beyond, because when I was in school in Colombia, the only thing that I learned was sort of the narratives around independence, right? And that was pretty much it. And having grown up here, I felt like really disconnected of sort of that broader national history. But then I also learned that if I had grown up there, maybe I wouldn't be necessarily that much more connected, because this is not taught in the curriculum anyways. But it has been a process of sort of both rediscovering the country where I'm from, and also like situating and positioning like my own family's histories through that process. Through this process of learning about the history of the armed conflict. For example, I learned, so I found out where the FARC had started, and it's actually not that far from my families are from originally, because my families are not from Ibagué, like both my parental and my maternal, but from the south of Tolima. And so learning again how that has also shaped my own family history has been a process. It also, I think, it raises, I think, was it Clelia? Yeah, I think Clelia mentioned, right? There's a lot of amnesia, both at the level, like at the national level, and kind of the discourses and narratives that are taken up, but also within families, right? And what gets shared and passed down, and for many different reasons, right? And as Nancy mentioned, there's also different competing narratives around like and this is again one of the limiting factors of transitional justice frameworks. It's like, when do you take the start of the conflict, right? And so some of the earlier frameworks from the early 2000s would say 1985, and that's the only aspect of the armed conflict that we are taking into account, and reparations will only happen up to that year. With the 2016 peace accord, and in particular in terms of symbolic reparation, like that framework was expanded to the halfway through the 20th century. But again, and as the narratives, for example, from the Women of Mapuhan show, the violence and the conflict, right, depending on what angle you use to understand and what perspective, actually has a much longer duration. And a lot of these struggles that, if you again sort of take into account sort of relationships to land, and yeah, again, sort of kind of expand beyond sort of the frameworks that are provided by normative frameworks of transitional justice. And I think there was something else, Nancy, that you mentioned that I wanted to address, but I think
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
And yes, I'm going to be in Colombia in the summer, so let's talk.
Awesome.
Diana, thank you so much. I know you do have an appointment to get to, so I think we can probably start wrapping up. It was incredible to hear your work. It was incredible to hear everyone's questions and sort of the discussion that evolved. So thank you everyone for your participation and engagement. This will be posted on the YouTube page, so feel free to return. Diana, if you want to share your email in the chat, that would be great if you would like. And everyone, please do check out CIER student series.eventbrite.ca. We're going to have a couple more events before the end of academic term, so I hope to see you there. So again, thank you, Diana. Thank you so much. And feel free, I'll leave you for the last words.
Yes, I remember the thing that Nancy talked about, which was the reach of the Truth Commission. And I'll just add a small thing there. That was sort of, I was part of the work of the Truth Commission here in Canada, actually, because the Colombian Truth Commission did a work, attempted to include the narratives of people who lived in exile, so who were, who are currently living outside of Colombia and are in exile because of the violence of the armed conflict. And it's actually, there were many challenges, both institutional, structural, and whatnot. But it was also the first time that a Truth Commission attempted to include the voices of those of people living in exile, and the work was done in 24 countries. So Canada being one of them. So that's also why I'm quite in tune of a lot of the different formats and work that was done by the Truth Commission. So I just wanted to add that to Nancy.
Thank you so much. Good to know about that process too. That's interesting.
And then, yes, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. Yeah, I shared my email in the chat, so feel free to email me. And then, yes, this was a wonderful Spaces. Thank you so much for inviting me.